One is to consider consider the domestic economic needs as the priority and not the interests of global capital as the priority.
معنا اليوم دكتورة إنجرد كفانجرافن، وهي محاضرة في كينجز كولدج في لندن، ولديها إسهامات بحثية بالغة الأهمية تتعلق بأزمات الديون في الدول النامية ومنها مصر. إزاي تحولت سوق الديون المحلية في مصر من قصة نجاح لأزمة؟
The IMF and the other international financial institutions, northern donors, have been pushing for this development and deepening of capital markets across the world and in the African region in particular. And they understand, like the assumption is that the development of local currency bond markets would lead to a lot of benefits, right? And generally this have been like repeated everywhere. So like one would be it's seen as a way to attract additional financial resources, especially if opened up to foreign capital, as was the case in Egypt. Local currency bond markets are expected to contribute to like the development and deepening of domestic financial markets, including corporate bond markets and like patient capital. It's expected to reduce financial fragility and external vulnerability, given that currency mismatches would be removed, or this is the idea, and that countries would no longer need to accumulate foreign exchange in order to service external debt. And then it was also anticipated that local currency bond markets would increase or reduce the need to hold costly foreign exchange reserves. So because of these assumptions that were kind of pushed into the sort of global narrative, since the mid-90s, the share of local currency debt in total debt for low-income countries across the board and lower middle-income countries has grown a lot. And in Egypt, it grew, I think it was 70% of public debt by 2020, so quite high. But as you point out, these expectations weren't met, and the markets actually became a source of turbulence. Some of the reasons for the increased instability are that, so one is that it's not just that the local financial markets were developed and like domestically based, but they were opened up to non-resident investors, especially countries like Egypt and Ghana have been the most accommodating to non-resident investors, to foreign investors. And governments across the region have been very supportive of foreign capital, allowing foreign investors to leave the market as soon as there's sign of turbulence.
اتكلمتي في أبحاثك عن مفهوم التبعية المالية للخارج، ممكن تشرحيه لنا؟
So international financial subordination, or IFS as we call it, is a framework that I put forward with some co-authors, 6 co-authors. It was a big paper that came out last year. Elias Alami, Carolina Alves, Bruno Bonizzi, Anina Kaltenbrunner, Kai Kodenbrock, and Jeff Powell. So there's a lot of people working on this. So it's an umbrella term to discuss a big literature, an old literature, on the ways in which finance and production are shaped by certain hierarchies. So within this framework, international financial subordination, IFS, is understood as a relation of power, of domination, between different spaces across the world market, which is expressed in and through money and finance. So this relationship, this unequal relationship, penalizes actors in the global south disproportionately, as is evident in like vulnerability to volatile financial cycles, limited space to pursue policies that violate the interests of international financial agents, and quite broadly, the fact that economic development is dependent upon the dynamics located at the top of the global economic hierarchies. So some examples could be like global investors searching for short-term yields, and therefore going to the global south basically only for short-term gains and leaving as soon as things get bad. Volatile capital flows driving financial crises, and sharp exchange rate swings driven by conditions of international financial markets.
هل صندوق النقد الدولي مسؤول عن ترسيخ التبعية المالية؟
So the IMF it promotes certain policies that are about opening up economies to global capital. it has the role in the power structure is an interesting question. It has power in terms of setting the hegemony of what is good policy, but it also has specific power on countries that need IMF loans, right? So there are a few different things that a country in that situation could do, but each option carries some limitations and drawbacks as well. So there's a kind of contradiction in terms of what the IMF is promoting, because it's promoting developing local financial systems, which increases the financial sector and integrates the financial sector to the sort of the global financial system, which you would think would require an increase in state capacity to manage that integration into the global financial cycle, like exchange rate management, reserve accumulation, financial sector measures, capital controls. But the way that the IMF promotes the policies is like a package where it's also about decreasing state involvement in the markets. So that creates this kind of contradiction where you're put in an impossible situation where you could experience something like huge capital outflows, but you don't have the capacity to actually put in place policies that could prevent that.
في رأيك إيه هو موقع مصر في التراتبية العالمية؟
It's I would say it's subordinate in the global hierarchy, in the sense that it depends on it has relatively weak production structures. Its financial system is quite tightly connected to the global financial system, and it's very largely impacted by swings in the global system. So in that sense, it often needs to react to things that are happening globally rather than being able to have an independent sort of monetary policy.
هل كان المفروض ما نتبعش سياسات صندوق النقد؟
I would say, if possible, they don't make much sense in terms of if the goal is, it depends on what the goal is. If the goal is to industrialize and develop a strong, diversified production base and have some kind of autonomy over the financial system and the economic system, then what the IMF is proposing, like opening up and liberalizing, wouldn't lead to that.
هل انتهت صلاحية سياسات صندوق النقد في رأيك؟
I think it is completely wrong. I wouldn't say outdated because it was never correct. I think it's based on kind of Eurocentric economic principles about assuming that markets work in a rational way to support capitalist development, and it's going to be stable, it's going to be rational. Which is an assumption that is based on how economists think that capitalism evolved in Europe, although it didn't. It was always very turbulent and exploitative and things. But it's taking this assumption of how seeing capitalism as its rational economic system to argue for liberalization and deregulation and privatization, assuming that markets will increase efficiency and everything. And this was wrong when they started promoting it in the 80s. And it had horrifying effects.
إيه هي التوصيات اللي المفروض الصندوق يغيرها؟
It can allow for some policies that normally it wouldn't allow for, like I mentioned already, capital controls, which there was a moment after the financial crisis where the IMF started issuing some reports saying that maybe capital controls could be used in some instances. Because the problem that Egypt and other countries have is that when there is a moment of turbulence, that capital leaves, and therefore the whole situation escalates.
هل في تجارب عالمية نجحت في الاستقلال المالي؟
So they just didn't follow those that particular aspect of like the push for market-based finance. They didn't like Kenya and Ethiopia, for example, have a very strong regulation of like the amount of non-resident investors they allow in their local currency debt markets. So that is a way to manage that aspect.
إيه رأيك في البريكس ومدى قدرته على الحد من التمويل بالدولار؟
But it doesn't really challenge for a country like Egypt, or I don't know, any the countries that we looked at in our study. It doesn't tackle the fundamental problem of having weak domestic economic structures and being vulnerable to global financial cycles. Because it's not just a problem of currency. It's a problem of of production and uneven development. So in that sense, I think it could provide maybe some moments of policy space and some moments of being able to manage volatility a bit better, but it's not going to fundamentally change the hierarchy, I think.
ايه هو نموذج التنمية البديل من وجهة نظرك؟
So an alternative development model, I would argue should take or could take two steps that come to mind. One is to consider consider the domestic economic needs as the priority and not the interests of global capital as the priority, because that's what IMF tends to force countries to do, right? To actually adjust according to the interests of global capital. So this was one of the insights from the late economist, the late Egyptian economist Samir Amin, who was talking about delinking. And he didn't mean delinking in the sense that you need to not trade or it's not autarky. It's about reorienting your economy towards domestic interests, for jobs and jobs for the people and whatever, it's the democratic electorate wants. And that would require some kind of shielding of the economic and domestic markets. It could involve import substitution industrialization, as you mentioned. I think there are a lot of things that could be done to kind of create a model that leads to more industrialization than what's the case at the moment. There are some limits to that, and that brings me to the second point, which is that because of this, the constraints that are imposed on countries in the global south in terms of what they can do in terms of industrial policy and trade policy and financial policy, there would need to be a readjustment of global international institutions in general, the WTO, IMF, World Bank, etc. Creation of more policy space so that countries actually can have autonomous industrialization plans, etc. And ultimately, if to break down the actual hierarchy that exists and it's very, very rigid, there would need to be some kind of change to the global system itself. But I know that's a very difficult task. So let's start with the more kind of domestic policies to think.
Thank you so much for your answers and for this a little bit long interview.
My pleasure. I hope I wasn't too pessimistic. Sorry about that.
It was great. Thank you so much.